a real mountain or whether you're using a hyperbaric chamber. We have some short-term increases and some long-term increases depending on which resource you're looking at. The long-term increases, some of them will take around 2.5, 3 months. Other resources say no, they take a bit longer than 3 months really. So the short ones, you're still looking at a minimum of 3 weeks to see the short-term adaptations, changes in pulmonary ventilation. So when you're exercising at altitude, remember we said that pulmonary ventilation goes up, we breathe deeper, and we breathe faster once we start to exercise. So it takes 3 to 4 weeks for that to kind of drop back down to your regular breathing rate. And then, again, a minimum of 3 weeks before we see increases in erythropoietin from the kidneys, and the EPO stimulates the bone marrow to release additional red blood cells. So again, takes a minimum of 3 weeks before we start to see an increase in red blood cells and oxygen carrying capabilities if we're training at altitude, okay? The long-term ones that take more than 3 months probably, you'll start to see an increasing capillary density around the muscles that are doing the work. So again, it's the body's attempt to try to get as much oxygen to the muscle cells as possible, given that saturation is lower than normal. Okay? The enzymes that work for system 3, so the enzymes within Krebs cycle and the enzymes within the electron transport chain will increase in number and in activity level after 3 months. So yeah, we're trying to do the best we can given that oxygen pressure and saturation levels are lower than they would be below 5,000 feet. Right? And gradually then cardiac output picks up a little bit, but it doesn't go back to normal. And we talked about, I think we did talk about, right, the live high, train low idea. That's the current recommendation for optimal adaptation, is that you try to live and sleep somewhere relatively high in altitude and get down below 5,000 feet for training, so that you don't have to drop intensity during the training session. Because if you're up at the high level for the adaptations, you cannot train at that really high intensity. You have to pull off training intensity and possibly volume as well. All right?
So without working out at a high elevation, just living there and just doing day-to-day things, you're still going to see those increases?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the thing to remember though is that whatever you do, however long you spend up there, your endurance performance is always going to be less than it would be if you were at sea level. All right? So it's really great if you can put in all this extra training, gain all these extra red blood cells, and then go down and compete at sea level. Now you've got a mega advantage, which is why people like to, not like to, but choose to do blood doping or take EPO, right? Because the advantage when you come back down in altitude is huge. That's my last one. And I just wanted to have a brief mention, because quite often this is a question that I get about these masks. that you can get now. And I haven't had a chance to look at the website this semester, but last semester I went in and double-checked because they used to tell quite a few porkies on their website. So this printout is, oh, this is quite old, this is 2015, and they used to say some really quite outrageous claims for what this mask can do. As I say, I checked the website last semester, and they have turned down many of their claims. It does not increase your ability to process oxygen. It is not training at altitude, it's a mask. And what you get to do is control how difficult it is to breathe in and out through the valve. So what it does do is strengthen the respiratory muscles, the diaphragm, the intercostals, and then the indirect effect of strengthening those muscles is that they're able to change the volume of the lungs by a greater amount, and that sucks in more air and therefore makes more oxygen available. But they're not training your oxygen capacity. That's not true, all right? But yes, so like for swimmers, it might be a really great idea because they wouldn't have to breathe as often during a stroke, and if I can keep my head down, I'm more aerodynamic than having to keep turning my head to take a breath, right? So for swimmers, doing some diaphragmatic training might be worthwhile, for example, right? But just, you know, as I said, you've got to start being a little bit critical of things that you hear and read, right? If somebody makes a definitive statement about something, doing something, go and check what you know, right? Pull your textbook or go online. If you haven't put your key code in, put your key code in, because I think even if you sell your textbook, right, having your key code means you've always got access to at least the level of information you had when you took the class. Even if they've produced new editions of the textbook, you can still go back and look at your textbook online. Don't waste that key code, right? Because there's many people out there trying to make money off of you by telling little fibs, right? They just ever so slightly bend the information. Okay? All right, so I'm going to go. Anybody got questions, other questions about altitude? I'm going to go on to heat, hopefully. Is the right one? Yes. Please remind me at the end of this today to check Blackboard and make sure that the whole lecture is open and available for you. Okay? So the big issue about exercising in the heat is your body's ability to maintain stable core temperature and operative functioning, right? So temperature changes in the atmosphere get sensed and information sent to the sensory nervous system by receptors in your skin, receptors in the arteries in your neck will test if the blood temperature is going up, So when we're talking about cold, remember that hyper is too much, hypo is too little. So heat stress is hyperthermia, cold stress is hypothermia. All right? So don't get those two muddled up, because then you'll get muddled up with the reading that you're doing. Okay? Remember that we've not only got the heat from the environment, but that when we are making energy, we're actually not very efficient animals at using the energy in the food that we eat. Somewhere around 60 to 75% of the energy in the food that we eat gets released as heat within the body. We only actually use sort of 40 to 25 to 40% of the energy in our food. Okay? So we've got heat that we're releasing internally, as well as heat that we're having to deal with from the environment. All right? So, technical terms, I think we talked about ambient temperature. On Friday, we talked about humidity. We also have to look at wind speed, especially where we are. Is that a good thing or is that a bad thing in relation to heat? All right, so we'll take a look at that. So elevated heat then is a real challenge to the body, because we have, again, we've got this high-low situation, right? Except this time, instead of a pressure gradient, we have a heat gradient. So the hotter my body is, the harder it is, the less steep my slope, my gradient is between my body and the atmosphere. Okay, so it gets harder and harder to release heat. And normal core temperature, everybody knows, is somewhere around 98.6. It's typically a little bit lower first thing in the morning, a little bit higher last thing at night. 98.6 on average if you're healthy. Doesn't matter who you are. If you're human, average temperature is 98.6. All right? We don't have very much flexibility in that temperature. Okay? By the time you hit 105, 106 degrees Fahrenheit, then you are seriously ill and at risk. Okay? So there's very little wiggle room there for increases in core temperature. So some of the ways that we lose this heat, right, or pick up heat, okay? So convection, so air may be blowing across the surface of my body, all right? Well, that's good. That means I like the wind, right? The wind is a good thing on a hot day because it moves the air directly away from next to my skin that already heated up, blows that away, brings cool air in, allows me to release more heat. Okay. Then we have conduction, which is contact between two surfaces. So the ground that I'm walking on might be hot. If I'm sitting in a bath of cold water, that's conduction. I lose heat because the water is colder than my body and heat goes from high to low. Right? That's why ice baths are so useful when we're looking at training in the heat. Oh, let me go back a minute to convection. So convection then is one of the reasons why, convection and conduction are the reasons why if you go to a pool that is a competitive training pool, the water is cool, right, compared to a recreational pool. The water in a training pool is really chilly because they're getting hot, and and they have to be able to release that heat, so they make the water in the pool cold so that the swimmers don't overheat while they're training. But it's pretty chilly. It's too cold for me. Right, then we have radiation. So radiation, we've got molecules that emit waves, so the sun is emitting radiation. It's worse at altitude. Remember I said that the level of filters is shorter the higher up I go. So we have higher intensity of radiation at higher altitude and more risk for sunburn. And then we have evaporation, which is a really key one for us, where water on the surface evaporates and cools as it evaporates. So sweating is a very important mechanism for cooling when you're training hard. Right? So if we think about these ideas, then the reason we like a fan on when it's hot is because a fan provides convection. Right? So, conduction though, if we think about this ice bath idea, what do I do if I'm a coach and I have a kid who's overheating, but I don't have an athletic trainer and we don't have an ice bath? Okay? So, next thing, stand them in a cold shower, or better, lie them down in a cold shower and plug the bottom up if you can. Right? You want as much surface area as possible in contact with the cold water. Right? Wet rags, and just keep wiping them down with wet rags. Get an ice pack and get it on their head or on the back of their neck. Right? Cover their body with ice packs if you've got enough ice packs to do that. So the key is to get as much surface area as possible in contact with something cold if you've got someone who's starting to overheat. Right? And you want to do it as quickly as possible. Okay. So, yes?
That doesn't cause any kind of shock or anything? Like, don't think someone can put ice bath after?
It might, but I think what I have read is that the risk from the overheating is so high that you have to risk the shock. Because the overheating can shut the brain down, shut the hypothalamus, and it's... All right, I don't know if I want to have that conversation yet. Let's come back to that. Okay. So even at rest, if it's a hot day, you find that your heart rate, your resting heart rate is a little bit higher than it would be normally. Right? Because we don't see an immediate increase in stroke volume if I'm at rest. Right? My stroke volume, the amount of blood coming out of my heart, is the same. But the central nervous system starts to direct blood flow to the skin, and so now I need more cardiac output. So if I can't increase stroke volume, I have to increase heart rate to increase Q. If you remember our Q equals heart rate times stroke volume. Right? If stroke volume is fixed, but I need more blood flow, then I have to increase heart rate. Okay. So it will redirect blood flow to the skin to try to release heat and to cool the blood down so that the cooler blood comes back to the internal organs. and try and start, hopefully don't get a rise in core temperature. How thin I am, right, makes a difference here. So the larger the body mass, so if you're a tall, big footballer, doesn't matter whether you've got equipment on or not, you already create more heat than a little small ice skating girl, right? That's just without equipment, that's going to happen. So the higher my body fat percentage, body fat acts like a blanket, right? It's insulation. So the higher my body fat percentage, the harder it is to release internal body heat. So my sister, I've mentioned a couple of times, my sister's a little on the larger side. She's always hot. Always hot. So it's like a furnace. You don't even have to have a hot water bottle. Just like put your hand out, right? So the fitter I am, the higher my cardiac output is. So if you go back to your cardiovascular chapter and check your adaptations, the more aerobically fit I am, the higher my cardiac output will be, and the easier it is to divert blood to the periphery to use heat. So we look at, again, another kind of seesaw idea. What's the heat gain versus what's my capability for heat loss? Can I maintain core temperature, or am I on a losing seesaw, right, where my core temperature is going up? So the higher the intensity, the longer the exercise, the environmental conditions all add to the heat gain, and I have these four mechanisms, and my sweating, and maybe outside cooling using a fan or an ice pack. If you watch the tennis players when they're playing in hot environments, they always put an ice pack around their neck and they sit under an umbrella, right? So they spend as much time in the shade as possible. They'll play the point on the court, and then they'll walk back, and they only have 20 seconds, so they'll walk back, they'll stand in the shade at the back of the court for 5 seconds, they'll come back out, because any time you can get out of the direct sun is beneficial to you as the athlete, right? And again, our hydration protocols are really key. The more hydrated I am, the better able my body is. If I'm trying to move blood around that's sticky because I've lost plasma volume because I'm dehydrated, I'm not going to be as effective at cooling at the skin, okay? Okay, so we have some risks with the challenge of altitude. We also have some risks with the challenge of heat. So the least problematical is heat cramps, very painful, but not life-threatening, right? So typically, someone who's getting heat cramps could be dehydrated, maybe they have an electrolyte imbalance. So specifically if they've got a sodium deficit, then they could have problems with cramping. Could be neuromuscular fatigue. So the signal coming down the motor nerve to the muscle could be a little skewed because there's fatigue at the system, and we're getting cramping because the sodium isn't going back, calcium rather isn't going back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, right? It's the most common heat illness for college players when they come back to two-a-days after the summer break and it's still really hot where they're training. Right? It can occur post-exercise. Typically it's triggered by really intense exercise while it's hot, but some people will be taking a break and then they'll cramp badly while they're not actually moving, while they're having a rest period. So it is really painful. This is unkind. I'm going to be unkind. It's comical when you're not the one on the floor suffering them, right? Because you kind of, this person's like twitching and grabbing and you're like, oh, that seems like a little overkill, really. It's really, really painful, okay? So try not to be as unkind as I am. Treatment for heat cramps, rest, cooling, fluids, electrolytes, range of motion stretching, so you want to do stretch to a point of tension, which will be probably earlier than normal because of the cramp in the muscle, and just hold it there for as long as the person can tolerate it, right? And just try to get those cramps to, you know, like you've got, when you cramp, what happens is the actin and myosin kind of get stuck and they don't relax and spread back out again. So you want to just hold that stretch for as long as they can put up with it. Maybe some gentle massage. Generally, cramping can be alleviated within an hour, you know, usually less. I've only, in all the times I've been working here, I think I've only ever had one athlete say, I've been having a continuous problem with heat cramps. Right? So for most people, it's a one-off, painful, usually because they're dehydrated and they haven't followed their hydration protocols. And then they learn a very painful lesson and they don't do that again. Right? Next level up is syncope. Syncope is characterized by your individual feeling lightheaded, a bit dizzy, they may faint. And it often occurs when they sit down after having been pretty active, because what happens when you sit down, the blood starts pooling in your lower legs, and the stroke volume, the amount of blood that's returning to the heart, goes down. And so the amount of blood and oxygen going to the brain goes down, and they pass out. Right? Probably shouldn't sit. No, I think it's not a good plan to sit too much. Just try to stand or lean, you know, and try to keep the legs moving just a little bit while you're resting, rather than sit down and stop completely. That's when the problem seems to occur the most. So we have this excessive peripheral dilation that, as I said, impacts stroke volume, venous return. Always dehydration could be playing a role. And the reduction in venous return means we have a reduction in cardiac output. And if it's bad enough, we could see some damage to some brain cells. It's possible, although that isn't typical at this level of heat illness. Much more common in individuals who haven't been acclimatized to the heat. So again, if you're coaching and you bring a new athlete in and they're coming down from somewhere cold and you bring them into two-a-days and it's 95, 98 degrees or hotter, then this might be a problem. Right? Okay. The next two, you have to be a little bit careful with heat exhaustion and exertional heat stroke. So one of the things that happens, one of the really interesting environmental things about the heat, if I am training at 105 degrees in New Mexico, and it is 20% humidity, okay? So, body, atmosphere, right? And I'm sweating like crazy. So I've got heaps and heaps and heaps of water molecules on my skin. And it's 20% humidity. All that water is going to evaporate and help to keep me cool. Right? So even when it's really, really hot here, our evaporative mechanism is working very well to try to keep you as cool as possible. Now, the downside to this is that your sweat evaporates so quickly, you think you're not sweating. Right? And then, well, if I'm not sweating, I don't need to drink anything. And then I get dehydrated. Right? So, if you move to Alabama, now we have a different picture. Because in Alabama, it might be a little bit cooler, it might be 95 instead of 105, but it's 98% humidity, right? And now, all my sweat cannot evaporate because the atmosphere is already basically saturated. So, instead of evaporating, this water runs down my legs, down my arms, down my neck, down my back. It's like a continual river all day. Right? Actually, you get used to it, and then when you move here, it feels a little weird not having it. So, I quite miss it, actually. So, I mean, you're just like drenched the entire time. You're sweating so hard. So now we have a double whammy, whereas in New Mexico we really only have the one, right? Because now my evaporative system is not working. That means that my core temperature is at risk of going up. And I'm losing all this water, sweating like a... something I probably shouldn't say. And so now I can get dehydrated as well. Although, I have to say, it's much, because you're sweating so hard, you know you have to drink something, right? But it's a really interesting kind of different dilemma depending on whether you're working in the heat over here in the west or in the heat on the east. So, when we get to heat exhaustion, the more likely, she says, off the top of her head, I think we are more likely to see these very severe levels of heat illness in a humid environment than here. probably I'm wrong, but that's kind of that's how it feels when I think about the number of athletes that got sick when I was at Auburn. It was happening all the time. So level 1 serious is heat exhaustion caused by heavy sweating, okay, which you could be doing here, right? Dehydration, lack of sodium. Yes.
You say like lack of sodium. Would you recommend like those sodium pills?
Little sodium tablets might be a good idea, particularly if you don't put a lot of salt on your food. For most people, the amount of salt in our diet would be enough. But for a hardcore athlete who's training really hard, a little sodium tablet might be necessary. Or, as I said, most of the drinks have sodium in them. You just got to be a little bit careful with the drinks because obviously, here I go again. If you've ever known people who are anorexic or bulimic, particularly bulimic, one of the purging techniques is to drink salt water because it makes you throw up, right? And so, if the sports drinks tasted like salt water, no one would drink them. So the problem with the sports drinks is they pile a load of other stuff in to make them palatable so that you'll drink them. So there's flavorings, there's fruit flavors, there might be sugars or corn syrup, right? So you've got to be really careful with the sports drinks. If you can find a good one that doesn't have too much bad stuff added in to make it drinkable, then that would be a good idea. So, heat exhaustion much more likely in hot and humid, although that doesn't mean that it wouldn't happen here if someone didn't realize they were sweating as much as they were. Okay? Particularly, I mentioned the equipment is so sophisticated now. The materials that they make ski clothing and hiking clothing out of breathe and allow the sweat to evaporate. So you don't even get like a wet shirt under your backpack anymore to let you know that you're sweating because everything just evaporates and stays dry. So you have to remember to drain, right? It can be confused with level 2. That's the positive error to make, right? If you think it's worse than it is, you're not going to kill this person. Okay? That's important. Okay? So, some of the symptoms that you're looking for, okay, is someone who's getting continual cramping. So they cramp, you relax it all, they go back and train and it cramps again. If their color is very pale, and here's the thing, when you exercise in the heat, what happens to your face? It goes red and rosy, right? Your back might go red and rosy. Your legs or your arms might go red and rosy. So if you're working like Billy-O in the heat, and your person looks like this, that is not a good sign, right? That is physiologically not a good sign, right? So, pallor, if they're pale, that's bad. They may feel dizzy, headaches. They might start breathing too hard. Careful with the hyperventilation. Remember your brown paper bags, right? If someone's hyperventilating, you've got to flip that oxygen, carbon dioxide ratio. They may develop diarrhea, lots of appetite, and you'll see a decrease in urine output, although if they're not communicating that to you, that's a difficult one for you to pick up on as the teacher or the coach, right? But because the body will try to hang on to as much water as it can, their urine levels will be decreased, so they won't be peeing as often as normal. temperature is likely to be between 97 to 104. Okay? Then we go to serious level 2, exertional heat stroke. This has to be treated urgently, quickly, because this person is about to die. Okay? Bless you. So at this point, they're not really releasing anywhere near enough heat. Whether it's intense exercise or long distance, might not be mega high intensity, but they've been out running for 2.5, 3 hours, right? And at this point, the thermoregulatory center in the brain is completely overwhelmed by the heat in the blood, and it switches off the sweating mechanism. Okay. So, this can lead to a stroke. Right? Core temperature now is above 104 and rising rapidly because nothing is working anymore. Right? Death occurs at 109-ish.
How is that different from the cabin fever?
It's similar, yeah. I think that's why having a fever of 104 means you go to the hospital, because if they can't bring that fever down, then you're at risk of... If you read, like, old English novels and they talk about the fever, and everybody's really excited when the sweat breaks, because the sweat breaks means that the thermoregulatory center turned back on and the body temperature is coming down. Right? So, symptoms here. Tachycardia, so heart rate drops. Again, if you're working out in the heat, you would expect your heart rate to be going berserk, not getting lower. So that should be a big red flag. Right? Hypotension, so lightheadedness if they're sitting up and or standing up. Okay? Altered mental state, so they might start getting confused. They could have a seizure, and they could drop into a coma. So this is like, you have to be able to cool this person down. Preferably an ice bath, because that's the easiest way to get the entire body into something cold. But whatever you can get your hands on, you need to cool this person down as quickly as possible. Okay? So, shower, cold cloths, as I say. Get them in the shade. Get all their clothes off them and get them wet. Right? Do the best you can with the resources you have until an ambulance gets there. Okay? So, if you've got a choice, if you're umming and ahhing, does this person have heat exhaustion or do they have heat stroke? Treat heat stroke. Because the heat exhaustion is going to make them sick. They are not going to be well. But they're not going to die at that point. Right? But if you treat it as heat exhaustion and actually they're going into heat stroke, you're not going to be doing enough to stop them getting worse. Right?
If they do like have a heat stroke and they like go into a coma and they like come out of it, or you like dump them in an ice bath and they like come back to you or whatever, would they like have like symptoms of like an actual stroke, or like would they have like nerve damage?
I mean, if they had a stroke, you could see signs of stroke, so you might see some paralysis. I mean, you don't always have a brain stroke with heat stroke. You can. I mean, my hope is that you never have to deal with any of this, right? That you are well enough trained in your own hydration protocols, that you manage to train your clients, your athletes, your students, your family on hydration protocols, right? In your book, there's a very nice quote. It's sad, but it's really good. Says that death from exertional heat stroke is a tragedy of inaction. Because you shouldn't die from this. If you get them cold enough, quickly enough, they're not going to die. Unless they're unlucky enough to have a heart attack with the shock. But, as I said, generally, when you're reading the literature, most of the literature says get them cold as quickly as you can. If they have a heart attack, deal with that. But they're going to die if you don't get them cold. So, yes.
Is it more typical for that to happen like at a younger age or like an older age?
I haven't read anything about it being age-related. I can imagine that it would be more likely in an older person because they don't release heat as well because their cardiac output is going down. And so it gets harder and harder to stay cool as you get older. Well, either extreme. It's hard to get warm when you're cold and it's hard to get cool when you're hot as you get older. So it makes sense that it would occur more in someone who's older, but we lose athletes all the time in this country because of exertional heat stroke. So, uh-oh, we need to go, huh? Okay. I will check Blackboard.